everybody, you're watching a physio named Jonah. That's this guy. Today, let's be honest with each other, shall we? Okay, shall we? I think that each and every one of you who clicked on this video and read the title knows that we should not be diagnosing ourselves on the internet. Well, time to be honest, like we talked about earlier. You're still gonna do it, aren't ya? Aren't ya? Come on. You know you're gonna do it. You can just tell me. You're gonna do it. It's okay. I do it too. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through how to best navigate your way through self-medical diagnosis on the internet. My name is Jonah and I am a Canadian physiotherapist who makes videos on physio-related topics like the healthcare world. So if learning about your body, how it moves, and the healthcare world is interesting to you, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below and click the bell, of course, so you're notified when I release new videos just like this one. Okay, so how are we going to make this video work? We all know that self-diagnosis on the internet is bad and not something we should be doing, so how is the healthcare professional going to walk you through this? With a smile, baby, that's how! Self-diagnosis on the internet gets a bad reputation primarily because it drives a wedge between practitioners and patients, as well as can lead to the spread of misinformation. But it doesn't have to. Just because we are spending time looking things up online doesn't mean that has to come with these negative consequences. That's why I wanted to make this video in the first place. My goal is to help you understand how best to do this so that we don't fall into many of the pitfalls that self-diagnosing can often get blamed for. Obviously, there are a million different medical diagnoses out there, so this is not going to be a how-to guide of how to diagnose every single condition. If you look at the video length, you know that's not the case because that would be impossible. Instead, I'm going to be sharing with you some tips and tricks as well as recommendations on how to make your research and self-diagnosis process more effective and lead to better outcomes for you and the healthcare professionals that you work with. I'm going to try and make it more tangible as well by using a practical example that will follow through as we run through the steps. Get it? Got it? Good? Let's get after it. Step 1. Start with a broad search. When we're trying to seek a diagnosis or learn something in the medical world, it's really important that we don't start too narrow and filter all of our results down to just one thing that may or may not actually be the thing that we're looking for. So it's important that you start with a broad search and an open mind as you start looking for ideas using the internet. For my example that we walk through as we go through the steps, I'm going to assume that I'm a patient who has pain in the front of their shoulder. Why don't we go ahead and start with that broad start? Yeah, just don't overthink it. Now the first thing that you'll notice is that you get a lot of different options. And that's going to be a lot to peruse through, kind of take some read through, which is going to bring us on to step 2. Step 2. Never just believe one source. Never. And I mean that, never. There is so much information out there on the internet, it's completely overwhelming how much there is, and one person cannot feasibly get an idea of what sources are realistic and aren't for everything. So instead, what can be really helpful is going through a variety of resources. That way you can compare what each of them are saying, look for similarities, look for differences, and if one resource is saying something completely different from all of the other ones, it's going to stand out in comparison to those other sources. If we go back to my shoulder example, you see how in my scrolling here, I'm visiting a lot of different pages. You can read through a page to get the gist of what it's offering, but don't feel like you have to read every single page top to bottom unless you are comfortable sinking a fair bit of time into it. As I'm looking through these different pages, there's something very specific that I'm looking for, which is what diagnoses or conditions are being recommended. Step 3. Make note of the most common diagnoses that you're seeing. This is a very important process because looking through all of these different resources is going to help you get more specific later on. This is the process by which we look for which information is shared between the different resources that we're seeing. The most common threads, diagnoses, terms that we find recommended or suggested are going to be the first terms that we spend more of our time looking into as we continue this process. Going back to the example with the shoulder, some terms that seem to keep coming up here are rotator cuff, bursa, biceps tendon, tendinitis, frozen shoulder, and arthritis. These are the structures that seem to be most commonly mentioned as potentially posing a problem here. Step 4. Get more specific. And don't panic diagnose. Awesome! Now we have a list of medical terms, diagnoses, structures. I am an expert self-diagnoser. what does any of this mean? This is where we start to get more specific. Essentially, steps 1 to 3, we're all just gathering a whole bunch of ideas, and now we're going to spend some more time actually looking into them to see what fits best. Let's do some more specific searches now about those terms that we've looked up. Let's start by Googling frozen shoulder, since that came up and you may have heard it. As I'm reading through these articles, it's not sounding too much like my symptoms. I mean, it could be, but it doesn't really sound like a perfect fit. Next, let's check out shoulder arthritis. This one seems kind of scary. Oh, I mean, I'm getting a bit nervous here. Avascular necrosis? What do you mean my bone is dying? Pausing here, this is where we have to not panic. If you are going to be Googling and looking at medical information on the internet, you are going to come across big, scary terminology that may or may not have anything to do with your particular case. The most important thing you can do when Googling medical information is to not take the biggest and scariest sounding terms and apply them to yourself. If you'd like, you can make a note of them for later. It's a great thing to talk to a healthcare professional about, or maybe do some looking into afterwards. But just because something is big and intimidating and seems like it could be really bad, does not mean that it is something that you have or is even related to your situation at all. So other than those huge scary terms, it doesn't look like arthritis matches the pain that I am feeling. Let's move on and check out rotator cuff pain. Okay, yeah, now this is more like it. The pain sounds more like that type of front of shoulder pain that I've been having. Multiple sites mention it. Let's take this terminology and we're gonna move on from here. Step 5, formulate a hypothesis. Here's where you're gonna actually start to see some of the fruits of the labors that you've been putting in. You should have a sheet in front of you or some sort of note that has multiple different medical terminologies that you have looked up, taken the time to look into a little bit, and you should be selecting the one that seems like it's the most appropriate for you at this time. Taking the terminology or diagnosis that seems to match the most for you, we can now look into it a little further. The reason I call this a hypothesis and not a diagnosis is because nothing that we find online and say about ourselves is a diagnosis. It is a hypothesis because it's what we think may be going on. It is not an official diagnosis that has been given by a healthcare provider in any way. Essentially what I'm saying here is that we cannot diagnose ourselves. When we self-diagnose online, we're not actually creating a diagnosis. We're crafting a hypothesis of what we think may be happening. So in the example that we have here, the hypothesis that we're working with is rotator cuff pain. So looking into this a bit more, let's do some research on rotator cuff pain. This is a good opportunity to take some more time to look into this one medical condition and try to understand it a bit better if we think this could possibly be something that we are going through. I'm just gonna pick out a couple of, look at that. Oh, here it is again. Step 6. Talk with a healthcare provider and share your findings. Yes, this is an absolutely crucial phase of any self-diagnosis journey. Receiving an actual medical diagnosis. I don't view patients self-diagnosing themselves or taking a look at things online before they come to see me as a bad thing in the slightest. I think when self-diagnosis becomes more of a challenge or a problem is when we use the internet to create a self-diagnosis for ourselves and we don't use that as a communication point with an actual healthcare provider. At its best, this whole process of going through research, taking a look at different diagnoses, can lead to a really productive and excellent conversation with your healthcare provider. One that actually makes a lot more sense to you and you will understand and have more stock in because you put in the time researching and thinking about it beforehand. I will say though, you do not have to feel pressured to share any of this previous research, self-diagnosing that you've done with your provider, although it may be a helpful part of having a good conversation moving forwards. If you prefer to just keep it as some background knowledge in the back of your head and make you understand sort of the terms that they're talking about a little bit more, that's obviously fine as well. This next part is super important though. Step 7. Keep an open mind. If you are going through the process of researching, creating a self-diagnosis, hypothesis, using the internet, you really have to keep an open mind when going through the process in general and definitely when talking with your provider. Just because we found some sources online that did lead us towards a certain diagnosis or medical condition does not mean that this is actually the correct diagnosis for you. And this is not because you did anything wrong or it was a bad hypothesis. It could have been a really good hypothesis. But your medical practitioner has access to information that you just don't as a human being. And this thing that your healthcare provider has access to, which you don't, is called objectivity. As a healthcare provider, when we make diagnoses for a patient, we're combining subjective and objective information. Subjective information is reported sensations, while objective information is viewed findings from the outside. Think of subjective information as a patient saying how something feels, while an objective finding is more looking at how a patient moves or how a part of the body is functioning. We simply cannot be objective about our own bodies and about our own health. Take it from a healthcare provider. I can be objective about somebody else's healthcare. I am not objective about my own body and my own healthcare. Using the example that we talked about earlier, let's say we go to see our healthcare provider and instead of the practitioner thinking that it's rotator cuff pain, they think it's coming from the biceps tendon. This isn't the hypothesis that we thought, but it is in the terms that we were looking up when we talked about shoulder pain. Keeping an open mind that the diagnosis is not the main one that you thought, but while drawing on the research you did previously, this may help the conversation with your provider be that much more productive as you work through it. Summarizing here at the end, I think that self-diagnosis is a practice that is totally fair and productive for patients to engage in, as long as you include your healthcare provider. Following the steps that I outlined above can help you get some good information about your own medical health and then use that information in order to have a very productive conversation with your trusted healthcare provider. If you made it to this point in the video, thank you guys so much for watching. I truly hope that you enjoyed this video and found it helpful as you move through your own healthcare journey. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to drop them in the comments section down below. I do my best to respond fairly quickly, so I look forward to hearing from you and chatting with you soon. But most importantly though guys, as always, move your body, have a laugh today, and I will see you at the next video.